Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the State Bar of Texas Computer and Technology Section CLE webinar. Today's topic is Mastering eDiscovery Project Management, Strategies for Success. And this CLE is eligible for 1 hour of CLE and 0.25, a quarter of that will be eligible for ethics. My name is Kevin Clark, and I'm an attorney. I am the Chief Executive Officer of eDiscovery, as well as the Chief Legal Officer at the Masters Conference. And I'll be today's host for this program. We will be getting started with today's program in just a moment. But before we get started, just a few program details. I would like to remind you that today's program is being recorded and will be posted on the Texas Bar's website shortly after the event. A link to the recording will be sent to all of you that are attending. We encourage you to ask questions at any time during the program by typing them into the comments chat field, and your questions will be answered by the panelists either during the presentation or at the end of the presentation, if we have time, and at the discretion of the panelists. A little more housekeeping. Content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Questions posed by and opinions offered by the participants are for the sole purpose of improving our educational value and do not constitute legal advice. The views expressed by the members of the panel belong solely to the panelists themselves and do not necessarily represent the views or opinions of their organizations. There are no bad questions. Again, we will be taking questions throughout the presentation. So feel free to type any of your questions in any given time, and we'll do the best to circle back to them and answer them. Please remain on mute so that you don't create unnecessary background noise. Now, on to our program. I would like to start today's main program by having the panelists introduce themselves. Eric, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. My name's Eric Boyd. I'm the Director of Litigation Support and Docketing for Locklord, LLP. I've been in the industry since 1999, so I have quite a few years of experience and multiple projects of experience. So thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Danny?
Absolutely. Thanks, Kevin. Hi, everyone. My name is Danny Thunkachin. I have been the eDiscovery director at a number of large law firms, Thompson Knight, Drinker Biddle and Reith, Blankrome. I'm now the Chief Operating Officer for Intrepid Managed Discovery, which specializes in docket review and managing discovery across all kinds of litigation and all kinds of practice areas. So thank you for having me, Kevin.
So thank you, Danny. And Dwayne.
Hi, I'm Dwayne Lipes. I'm the Director of Litigation Support at Jackson Walker. I've been with Jackson Walker about 18 years, and I've been working with law firms for 25 plus years doing similar positions, and I'm glad to be a part of the panel today.
Excellent. Thank you, Dwayne. So today's agenda, we're going to cover several different items focused on eDiscovery. This is going to include project setup and start, budget and spends, technology and vendor selection, communications, reporting and metrics, deadlines and timelines, workflow, quality control, and closeout. So throughout this discussion, we're going to be sharing tips for running successful projects for eDiscovery projects. So this all starts with basically the EDRM is a model that was created about 20 years ago that sort of walks through the process of eDiscovery of projects. So we'll be as we go through our items we're going to talk about, we'll sort of follow through part of the EDRM model. And we're not going to go into a lot of detail on the EDRM model itself, but we're going to use this as a launching pad for our discussions. So let's first start with scope. Eric, how does scope play into a eDiscovery project? And then, at the beginning, you get a phone call from a team member, a partner at the firm. Let's talk about scope.
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. There are a few items that immediately think of whenever you've got a new project. And so the questions tend to be, okay, how many custodians? How far back in time? Where is the data? And what type of data are we looking for? And then once we get those questions answered, the next step is going to be, okay, how much data do we have? Do we have, a set of search terms and dates that we're going to be using to cull? And lastly, what kind of budget do we have? Meaning, is the case a bet the company case it's worth 20 million or upwards of $1 billion? Or is it, $1 million case that you don't want to spend 100 grand on eDiscovery for? Those are the types of things that come to mind when I get involved immediately.
Okay.
Kevin, I'll chime in with a few of the key questions that I ask as well. One are the causes of action, the nature of the litigation. So a breach of contract versus a labor and employment brings a very different perspective to what we would need to do in a particular case. So definitely, if there's white collar aspects, any kind of malfeasance or an adverse party, for example, insight into the adverse party, and are they very interested in alleging misconduct or spoliation scenarios? Those are all important aspects. Thinking about the elements that Eric just described about the actual volume of the litigation, the data that you're going to be getting, and pairing it with the strategic needs of the particular matter, and that contributes to the scope.
And one more thing that Danny just said, which is very important, is it's important to also note, whether your client is being charged with some type of malfeasance or fraud, and if so, is it appropriate for your client to be doing the collections themselves, or should we bring in a third party that we can point to as someone that's a trusted third party that the other side's not going to make a case with.
Right.
Very true.
And so as we discuss scope, let's say we now have the project. Let's go into a project setup. What are some areas, or what are some questions that you think about, that you ask, and some action items that you do as you move for getting the project started? Dwayne.
Yeah, some things just to kind of follow up on the scope a little bit with the project setup. A lot of it depends, and I'm sure that all of us on when we're brought into the case or when we're notified. Some things may have already happened, so to speak, as far as the collection, and depending on the type of case, like Danny mentioned. There may be some additional things that may need to be done for preservation and potentially collection. But assuming that, as far as the project setup, things have already, the process is already in place for the collection process, and you're now just trying to get a feel for what's going to be set up as far as a workspace. A couple of things that you need to be thinking about is just the size. Obviously, that's going to depend on what you're going to do as far as the setup, and you got to be looking at deadlines as far as okay, how soon is the production deadlines coming up? When does the review need to be done? So a lot of that's going to factor into, is that something that you're going to be doing in-house, or are you going to be doing potentially with an outside provider? But you've got to get a handle on specific timelines, and as far as what the case, the deadlines are, and the volumes, just to try to put into place some kind of parameters and assumptions on how to move forward.
I will add the slide that's on the screen. The EDRM workflow is a great place for those that are inexperienced with eDiscovery to start when they think about setting up a project. what are you doing for identification? What's the communication and conversations that you're having with the client about where that data resides? What are you doing about preservation? Litigation hold notices, have they been issued? Have you paid attention to unusual data sources? And 4 or 5 years ago, I would have said a data source like Signal or WhatsApp would be unusual. Now that's absolutely daily practice. You need to get to those types of messaging platforms. But now what we're calling unusual are going to be, what kind of generative AI tool have they used to create their documents? Brand new, unusual today, 5 years from now, it's going to become daily practice. So you got to take a few minutes and have that conversation with the client about preservation. And then how are you going to go get that? What's the collection process? The model does a very good job of laying out these considerations and how to think about it sequentially so that you have the project set up in a comprehensive way.
Right. You actually, that brings up a good point. With this new data types, new technologies, whether it's Slack, Signal, Telegram, now different LLM models, so with this new types of this new data, you may need different vendors or different companies that can actually come and will know how to pull that data, extract that data, so you can then review and everything. So let's jump over to a vendor selection and team selection and vendor selection. So Eric, let me jump over to you. Share some pointers on maybe how you would select a vendor.
Sure. Thank you, Kevin. So the vendor selection process is over time, it's involved as far as I go, just because I've used so many and I've had so many experiences. And honestly, so many of the vendors have merged where we used to have, 20 or 30 likely to handle. One moment.
Well, let's see. Dwayne or Dan, you want to jump in?
Yeah,
I think we had a barking dog. That's never happened to any of us. So hey,
Apologies. Thank you. So I'll just start back. There's not as many vendors to choose from as there used to be, right? So what you've got to do is you've got to balance price, you've got to balance expectations, and you've got to balance ability. So additionally, what's really important to me is project managers, the people that are running quarterback for you on behalf of the vendor. Because we're not just talking, processing and analytics and AI, but we're also talking review. So you typically want to use one vendor for both sides of that coin, for the review and the processing. But I'll also say that more and more firms like mine are also doing all of this in-house instead of using an outside vendor.
mm-hmm.
I will chime in as one of those vendors now. We make a point of communicating with our clients about our capabilities and capacities. There's a huge variety of tools and there are many, many levels of expertise. The challenge that I think most of the associates and partners I've worked with at a variety of firms is that they encounter this once, twice, 3 times a year. Next year, all of the tools and all of the technologies have completely changed underneath them. And when they come back to a tool like Relativity or Everlaw, a year later, the capabilities of these tools have changed. So that relationship with a partner and a service provider that keeps you educated, participating in CLEs like this, but that keeps you educated about what's current, what the capabilities are, what new technologies are out there is critical. It really speaks to the competence requirement that the bar requires as well about what all of these technologies do. It's our job as service providers, when you pick up the phone and give us a call, to educate you on the specific needs of a particular case. That's the role we try to fill.
Yeah, the only additional thing I might add was, depending on like Eric had mentioned, and we're no different either in our firm, is there's some things we do in-house. It depends on what we need the service provider to do in that particular aspect. If it's doing the collection, is it doing the review, or maybe they're actually going to do the whole project, but it really depends on what piece of the project they're going to be doing, and then finding the right, way to, get the project as well as the pricing. Because at the end of the day, the biggest challenge, and this has always been this way, is just being able to, when you reach out to select a vendor, make sure you've got good information on the assumptions, because at the end of the day, you want your client to know you're going to have to pass this information to your client and get some kind of estimate. And it's going to be critical to know exactly what they're doing and exactly the parameters, just so that you can give a reasonable estimate of what they're going to be doing is going to cost, just so that if something changes, and you don't want that surprise at the end of the first month, whenever you get a bill and it doesn't match up with what the estimate was. So it's really important to get as much information as you can, get the parameters, get the assumptions, just so you can make sure you give your client a good expectation of what the cost is going to be.
Right.
Kevin, if I may, not everybody is going to have an Eric or a Dwayne in their firm available to do this process of translation. So it's important to ask your vendors to be completely transparent. There isn't a whole lot of this that is rocket science. They can explain the math, they can explain the costs, and they can be very transparent with you about why things cost what they cost. And they should be equipping you to be able to talk to your clients about why things cost what they cost. When you have an Eric or a Dwayne, they're a fantastic resource. I've worn that hat too. We want to be that resource for you. And whether inside the firm or outside the firm, we're here to help you get through that process.
Right. And something you said, Dwayne, so definitely we want to come back to budget and spend, because that's an extremely important part of the eDiscovery process. But even before we do that, another point was brought up. And so in order to get CLE credits, I think we need to bring this part up about the duty of competency. ABA rule, model rule 1.1 and comment 8. This model rule has been adopted by over 44 states in the country, and basically explains that there needs to be a competency. Attorneys need to have a technological competency. And Texas has adopted this rule. It's under section 1.01 and also comment 8. So there's definitely a duty. We as attorneys definitely have duty for technological competency. And so, and part of that is understanding, I think, the eDiscovery process, or having an understanding of, if you don't understand it, understand where you can go to find out about it. And again, that's maybe the Eric's in his firm, the Dwayne's in his firm, maybe outside consultants, whatnot, but definitely have those resources, whether it's inside the firm, outside the firm, have those resources to go to and help you out when you get, when you have questions and need to understand what's happening. So let's jump back to budget and spend, which Dwayne had started to talk about a little. That's obviously from a client's perspective, so extremely important, right? We need to understand what the costs of the project is going to be. We need to understand what the costs of the technology are going to cost us. So who would like to discuss more a little about budget and spend, and provide some pointers to our audience?
I don't mind kicking off this.
Okay.
The subject. I'll just tell you that the best way to be with not only the partner that you're dealing with, but the client as well, is just upfront, exactly with how much data there is, has everything to do with what it's going to cost, right? So first question is, how much data is there? What are we doing with that data? And then how much can we cull that data in order to review and produce? So, some vendors have an upfront per gigabyte price. all in. Others have it broken down by collections and then processing and then promotion to review and then productions. So you just need to find out upfront what the parameters are and then just plug in your numbers with the sizes and the expectations. Because, typically we know that when we have a large collection, did we cull at collection, or did we collect everything and the intention is to cull later? So all of those are questions that come into how you set up your budget and what the costs are going to be. So it's just very important that you're upfront, and if anything happens, during the process, it's going to cause the budget to increase, you immediately pick up the phone and let the partner and the client know that the budget's a little bit higher than we expected and why. Because the last thing you want to do is get a surprise invoice at the end of the month that's going to set the client off, because it exceeds expectations of what their expectations were.
No
Right.
surprises.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a lot of what drives the budget and the spend is the deadlines. And just like Eric mentioned, obviously the volume and because the biggest expense in any of these eDiscovery is the review, and being able to get that to a reasonable amount, but then also look at whatever that reasonable amount is and figure out what's the deadline. Then you're going to have to figure out, it's put the math to it and say, okay, I need this many attorneys reviewing it and for this many days. And then that's what you want to end up submitting to your client, and that's what they're going to approve or not approve. And then you've got to manage the process within that. So that's the key that is always going to be the driver, the size of it, the amount of review, and the deadline, because depending on when the deadline is going to depend on how many people you need to get on.
And thanks, Dwayne. And what I would say is, at this point, within the processing and the review side is where you bring in analytics and AI to help manage that project and to reduce the cost and spend. So I don't know if this would be an appropriate time to insert that, or Danny, do you have any other thoughts on the budget?
Thank you for that. So I do wear a slightly different hat now because I'm responding to the budgetary requests from the other side. I think it's very important for the firm and associates and partners on matters to be transparent about their budgetary expectations. There is a lot that I can do to keep a project in scope, in budget, and I can have a meaningful conversation with you about strategy to be able to save money on the eDiscovery workflow and processes. We may not review every document. We may not process every document. We may be able to draw clear lines, defensible lines, either through the use of forensics or experts, or the use of AI, either generative AI or technology-assisted review, to give you strategic cover to be able to make a burden argument, to be able to tailor the response so that you can keep it within the scope of the case and the budget available on the case. Proportionality it comes up over and over again in eDiscovery conversations, and it's my job to equip you to be able to make a proportionality argument. So open communication really does a lot to help me provide those services for you.
And that's right. Danny mentioned earlier needing full transparency, knowing what the case is about, reading the complaints, reading the responses, so that we have a full understanding of what's being argued about, what the case is about, who are the players, how can we limit the custodians, how can we limit the time frame. All of that plays into budget, but also what plays into budget are things like reducing through search terms and culling by dates and limiting custodians, and then threading emails if it's appropriate. And then additionally, once you start the review, doing something like TAR or CAL, which is continuous active learning, which is while you do the review, while you're reviewing documents, the model is updating and it's re-indexing and it's promoting only likely responsive documents, as opposed to just doing a linear review. With the with the invention of AI many years ago and the adoption by the industry, we may have 100,000 records to review after calling and threading, and we find somewhere between 10 to 20 to 30 or 40% of that is responsive and the rest isn't. Now, not every case is like that. Depends on what the type of data that you're looking at, the type of communications that you've been giving, and so forth. But I'll tell you, it has been a game changer. Kevin, I've worked with you on several reviews where we've limited ourselves to only having to review 30% of the population by utilizing AI.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then these are really good points. As was shared earlier, the review piece is typically the most expensive piece in the eDiscovery process. And the good thing is there have been technologies that have been developed to help minimize those costs or reduce them. And so, such as email threading, I think Danny mentioned that, CAL, TAR, and there's a whole new technology that's now being applied called LLM or generative AI, GAI, and that's just in its infancy. It came out about a year and a half ago. A lot of you may have used it in ways such as ChatGPT, but it's being applied to the legal industry. And I think it's definitely something worth watching. We were not going to go into too much detail today about that, but we'll say definitely keep your eye on it and continue to watch, and let's see where it goes. It's part of going back to our duty for technological competency. It's just we need to understand what technologies are out there and how they may be able to help us help our clients. So does anybody want to talk about CAL, TAR, or GAI, any of the technologies? Any final thoughts on that before we move on?
Well, Kevin, I think you hit it on the head. Generative AI technology is going to fundamentally change the document review process in the coming years. It is bleeding edge. It's not bleeding edge anymore. It's cutting edge now. We're doing a lot of testing. We are learning more every day about the impact that this is going to have on the practice of law across the board. It's going to affect every aspect of our practice. So the tools are maturing really quickly. They're changing. They're saving clients already. This week, it saved one of my clients about 50% on their review costs. So it can make a significant difference. It just has to be used with caution as we continue to learn all the nuances of using large language models.
And I'm also interested in hearing from Dwayne on this. Typically, now when you enter into some of these large litigations, the parties will try to stipulate to an ESI protocol, and not everybody likes to do this, and it's not required, but it certainly is helpful when both sides are on the same page as far as what technology they're allowed to use, whether they're going to use deduping only by SHA-1 or any other algorithm, MD5, or if you're going to allow for textual deduplication, and then whether or not TAR or CAL is even addressed in the ESI protocol is important. And so, Dwayne, I'd like to hear us both being on the law firm side. What are you seeing out there? Are you getting more and more ESI protocols to review?
Yeah, I think it's becoming more important to establish that up front because I think in the past, it's just like anything else. We may get that protocol after the horse is way out of the barn, and so then we have to go figure out, okay, how do we comply with that? After everything's been collected and possibly processed. The time to do that is in the beginning. when you're doing the collection, if you're, make sure that if you've agreed to a protocol, you got to make sure that you're collecting and processing things in a way that at the end, when you do your production, that you've met and you've collected and what you've agreed upon. So I see that's happening more now. It's just because it's primarily with just the amount of technology changes. I think Danny mentioned this up front. We have so many sources of data now that have changed. I mean, we're no longer just capturing email and documents, but we're collecting so much electronic information that's not very standard. I mean, a lot of it's on mobile phones, and that information is not your typical type messaging apps, and you've got to somehow work that into the protocol and be able to get that information out properly. So it's a good and a bad. Everything's now electronic, but there's also so many sources, and there's not a lot of standards when it comes to these messaging apps and the way they work. And so you have to try to work. One other thing that we'll talk about that Danny mentioned, that we are going through a change now with generative AI. And one thing I think that the firms have to embrace, anytime you have a technology shift like this, you've got to really get the benefits of the technology. It's going to require a process change. The way that we've done things in the past is not going to be the same way we're going to be able to do things in the future. And to just use an analogy, it's kind of like perfuming the pig. I mean, if you just apply technology to an existing old process, you're not going to really get the benefits out of that. So this is over the next few years, we're going to see a lot of change. Not only the technology is changing, but the process and the way we do things is going to change as well.
Right. Thank you. Now, we just discussed ESI protocols. Let me ask the panelists. Do you think should every case have ESI protocol? Are you in favor of ESI protocols, production protocols? I've heard some arguments both sides. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'll tell you that they've been helpful in most cases, except that when the other side tries to use them in their favor and go overbroad. So you have to be very careful to what you agree to. That's how some of the folks have gotten in trouble in some of the rulings that have been adverse on discovery around some of the new technology that doesn't necessarily have attachments. There are links to other documents that are elsewhere. It's not an attachment, but agreeing to sort of these overbroad ESI protocols has brought them under adverse rulings because they agreed to it up front. So it's very important that you scrutinize the ESI protocol and make changes and edits where necessary to fit what you've got, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
That's right on point, Eric. I mean, ESI protocols are very helpful, but there is a strategic element about it, and the burdens are not usually fairly distributed between the parties as to the cost of collection, the cost of production. On many situations, on the defense side, we have to enforce those ESI agreements on plaintiffs that are very haphazard in their collection of data and not being sufficiently careful to preserve metadata or produce that metadata correctly. It will be it will be a critical document for the purposes of discovery. And there's a lot of very standard language out there, but if you do use an ESI protocol that's standard, make sure that you've talked to your client first about the kinds of data sources that they have access to before you agree to the particular format. They may be using, there are clients now, especially international clients, that do their entire business on WhatsApp. They're not even using email anymore. All of their, this is very common in Israel. I've had cases in China that use WeChat entirely for all of their transactions in business. You need to be aware of those and there are specific limitations about what you can and can't get from those tools before you commit to producing all metadata with all attachments and some of what Dwayne and Eric just described.
That's a very good point, Danny. We had a case a couple of years ago that was completely around WeChat. There were a few emails and attachments and documents and contracts, but the majority of the communications between the parties, which were Chinese, American, and Brazilian, were all WeChat. So you have to be careful with how you collect that data. You have to know what the limitations are. Some WeChats are based on the phone, some WeChats are on a computer, and some are cloud. And there are limitations on these applications on what you can collect based on where it's stored. If it's on the phone, it goes back quite a bit. If it's all cloud-based, it only goes back a year. So it's very important that you know upfront what you're dealing with and what the limitations are and where that data is stored.
And this rolls back to the vendor selection process. You need to know that your service provider has experience with the tools that are in question. You cannot, because the technology is changing every day, even for the service providers. So you'll have to have that open conversation with them. This is what we need. What's possible? And don't just accept, oh, we can take care of it for you as a quick and easy answer. They need to be able to demonstrate that they're able to going to get you what you want.
Thank you. So we mentioned before the most costly aspect of eDiscovery is the review piece, even looking at technology, looking at email threading, culling the data with dates, with custodial, limiting it to certain custodians, maybe search terms. But let's dive a little more into document review itself. So let's start off with what you need if you're going to have a doc review. What is the core piece that you're going to need? And then let's talk about the protocol. So Danny, you want to take that one? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say the first thing you need is a protocol. You need to, you need sort of a manual, a coding manual of what the expectations are, what defines a document as responsive or not. And one of the other main issues of a case are how many issue codes or other types of tagging are going to be involved, because that, if you have 30 issue codes, that really grinds the review to a halt, because you've got 30 different issues in your head, but while reading each document, what do these apply to? So you've got to be careful. You've got to weigh speed versus timelines versus, hot topics and issues. All of that has to be factored in. So the more issue codes you have, the more reviewers you're going to need. And the more issue codes you have, the much slower it's going to go. Those are just some thoughts off the top of my head. And I know I want to turn it over to Dwayne, because we've had conversations about this in the past about, how specific do the coding manuals need to be? Do you need to supply examples of different types of documents that you're looking for, and so forth?
Yeah, I think that depending on if you're doing, some of these are going to apply if you're doing an internal review of your, associates or attorneys inside your firm, or if you're using an outside contract reviewers to work. But, you need to have one attorney that's in charge, that's really fully knowledgeable about the case, the complaint, everything that's, what's the documents are and what, but they also need to be in charge to know, to be able to explain the review protocol and fully understand the full, and basically they're the project manager, but they're an attorney in charge. They need to know it. They know everything. They're the single point of contact. There's nothing worse than trying to get into a review and you've got too many cooks in the kitchen and it just doesn't work out. You need to have one person identified as the attorney in charge, even if it's an internal project, or if that attorney is working with an outside provider that can provide all the details about the case, answer any questions and there will be questions that come up during the review, but to be able to handle all the aspects of that, to be able to move it along smoothly, and also to be able to keep an idea of how the review is progressing as far as, is it on schedule? Are we meeting our deadlines and things like that? Are we staying on pace? But I think that's critical for some attorney to be on top of that the whole time and be responsible. And that's their main purpose, is to essentially be the quarterback of that review.
Right. So I'll add, a lot of times that will be maybe the partner or the associate at the law firm that's gonna be, running that review. A lot of times, going back to vendor selection or team selection, that team may be an internal team within that law firm, or it may be a vendor, maybe the law firm wants to hire contract attorneys, outside help to help them with that review. I think that's very important. We do have a question, which I'll ask the panelists. When you have a lot of issue codes, is it actually faster to spread out the issue codes with a certain sets of reviewers, like have multi-thread processing going?
So it's going to very much depend on the nature of the litigation. So for an internal investigation scenario, where I had subject matter expertise in different individuals. So one person was very proficient on FCPA issues, and the other person was very familiar with construction issues. We were able to train a TAR model to look at the same set of documents with different perspectives. That was really a good strategy in that particular scenario. However, if you're trying to get through, for compliance purposes, a defined set of documents in a certain amount of time for responsiveness and production purposes, you don't want to have the same document being looked at by more than one pair of eyes. All you're going to do is end up running up costs in that scenario. So, it's going to be specific. There's a project manager involved in setting up that review with you. And you will want to walk through your review guidelines, exactly what Eric said. Know what you're getting into up front, really develop a deep understanding of what you're looking for, because it gets very expensive when you pivot in the middle of a review and have to re-review documents. So yes, it's that conversation with that project manager that's going to make that decision for you.
Eric, Dwayne, anything?
I agree with a lot of what Danny said, because to the degree that you can, when you're looking at the document, reviewing it, not having to go back to it again to pull out more issues. I mean, once you're looking at it, that's the time to try to capture as many issues as you can. And obviously, just like Eric mentioned, the more issues that you add on, the slower it's going to be, just because it just takes more time to get through the document. But once you laid eyes on it for responsiveness or non-responsiveness, if you can also capture whatever, you're just going to save time, and it's going to save the client if you don't have to put eyes on it again.
And I think it's important to know up front, is this a document review to find responsive documents, or is this also a document review to not only find responsive documents, but to set up these issue codes to help you identify for use later on during strategy?
Very good points. Very good points. And great question. Please keep the questions coming. We're happy to try to address them. So let's jump to, we have the protocol for our doc review, and we're going to get started. Let's talk about the importance of reporting and metrics. I think these are very important to any doc review. The mastery of these two areas, I think, can really lead to a more successful doc review. So Dwayne, can I have you start off, and we'll discuss metrics and reporting?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. I think reporting and metrics are just, they're critical at any phase, but it's especially during the review. primarily just to make sure that you're staying on schedule, and looking at those on a daily basis, just to make sure, you can monitor the coding, the review team, and make sure that, because when you started this process initially, you probably put some kind of assumption on how many documents you were going to get through in an hour. And you also, just in order to, to kind of gauge, and you need to see if you're kind of meeting those timelines as far as the metrics goes, and making sure that, yeah, we're on pace to do what we're supposed to do. Because for whatever reason, if you're not, then you've got to make an adjustment. And if what you don't want to do is wait till you get closer to the deadline and realize, hey, we're not going to make it. You've got to know that. You've got to be proactive up front during the process to see, yeah, we're on schedule, and the metrics are the only way to be able to. Good metrics, good reporting is the only way to be able to really know that. So it's critical in the phase of a project.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that. We use metrics on these reviews. I review them daily. I want to know, who's your fastest guy, who's your slowest guy, and why is there that difference? We've had instances where I actually had one person that was reviewing like 5 docs an hour, and another one on the same team was reviewing 100 docs an hour. So a lot of goes into that. I mean, the 5 docs an hour guy might be reviewing some very long, tedious documents that must be read page by page and cover to cover. We've also had instances where the reviewer is just interested. They just want to review. They just want to read every document. And that's not what we needed. We needed someone to, overview a document and determine whether it's responsive or not and move on. So those are decisions you have to make early on. Well, this reviewer here is not what we need for this project, so let's replace them with someone who moves faster. Other types of information you get from those review sheets are, like Dwayne was saying, you use those to determine how much longer it's going to take and how efficient people are being. But you're also reviewing statistics like how much of this is responsive and how much of it isn't. And if most of it's non-responsive, do we need to look at our AI and verify that it's correct, and that are we reaching the end of the review if everything is non-responsive? And what I mean by that is because as you're going through the review, if we're using AI, we're promoting likely responsive documents first, so that by the time you get to mostly non-responsive documents, you're towards the end of the review.
I will add one key element and something to look for on these metric reports, and that's called the overturn rate. How frequently is the first decision made by a reviewer being changed during the quality control or later review process? And it doesn't necessarily mean that the reviewer is making a mistake. It could very well be that the review guidelines and the instruction to the reviewers aren't clear or are in some way ambiguous, or there's some type of document that is causing these reviews, them to be coded incorrectly. And that's a critical factor to look at early in the review process. You do not want to get 2, 3, 4 weeks into your review and decide that, there's some misunderstanding among the reviewers about what is a responsive document. I've had, unfortunately, clients, cases inside firms I've worked at where we come back 6 months later and say we have to throw out all the reviewers' work. That's terrible. And that first 2-3 days of reporting and communication with the review managers and the team is critical to make sure that the review is on track.
Mm-hmm. You brought up a great point about quality control. So let's move over into quality control. So let's see, Danny, I'll continue about that.
Quality control is. I make a statement that sometimes gets me in trouble, and that's that perfection is the standard, right? Our responsibility to our clients, whether firms or corporations, when we do legal work, is that we do it right, and we do it right every time. Human nature being what it is, technology and software being what it is, that is not always possible. But we need to approach that, and we need to put processes and technology in place, especially around quality control, that brings us closer and closer to that standard. And that's just a critical aspect of what we do. Unlike drafting or other aspects of legal practice, we're often in the eDiscovery and litigation support space asked to create yes or no answers. Maybes aren't usually good enough with what we do. Either it is responsive or it isn't responsive. Either it's relevant or not. It's a privilege or not. And so we're in a better position to be able to put a quality control process in place that ensures that we get it right. And that's why it's such a critical part of what we do. Eric?
Dwayne?
Yeah. Yes. Okay, good. I didn't know if it was me or Eric, but yes, I will just to echo more on what Danny mentioned, but the quality control aspect, it's really your last chance to make sure it's right, and obviously before you do any production, or if you produce your privilege, whatever you're withholding on your privilege law, whatever the aspect of the case that you're providing, it's your last opportunity to double check it, and it's critical. It's because you want to make sure that whatever you're sending out as a delivery is right and there's no mistakes. And so it's to me it's probably the most important step in the process, because it's your last chance to make sure that what's going out the door is correct. So you really got to lay eyes on it and do everything you can to make sure that work product is exactly what you think it's going to be.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, Kevin, if you said my name, I missed it. I apologize. But I agree with everything that Danny and Dwayne said, that the QC process is the most important. You need to use it early on and often, and the people you put on the QC need to be a much more advanced, higher level reviewers than what you're using for the first level review, because they're the ones who are going to catch any mistakes or any problems or any issues within and it's not necessarily the coder's fault. It very well may be the instructions given weren't clear, but that's how you very early set your models, and you very early on can spot any inconsistencies and know who's, whether everyone's on the same team or not, or same plan or not.
Right. Thank you. So, we have about 5 minutes left. Please send over your questions if you have any questions that we want to try to cover in the next few minutes before we wrap up. Let's jump to an area that we've already talked about. We've touched on, I think, throughout this entire CLE so far. But let's address it a little more directly. The importance of communication. So, Eric, I'll go back to you. Why is communication important?
Well, you need a format to accept, review, process, and answer questions from the review side. That's step number one. Step number two, you need the correct direct line of communications between the right channels on dealing with issues as they come up. We've been surprised by questions when they come in about certain types of data that we didn't expect to be in the review. So it's important to have a channel of communications to the right people. And I say that because I've been on cases in projects where they just create an all-in email address for everybody. And that doesn't work, because there's so many communications, people stop paying attention to them, not realizing that, oh, we need your input. So it's important to set up communications channels, but also you really need to be able to define who needs to be in what channels and who needs to be communicating what information to whom.
Uh, I'll chime into that. Roles and responsibilities. Anytime you have a team of more than 3 or 4 people on something, you need to define what roles and responsibilities are, especially in the data processing and discovery and review workflows because of the complexities and the number of variables involved. Um, you do not want, and this happens unfortunately too often, communications that go into the, hey, can someone look into this? And everybody thinks it's somebody else's job. And that task or project just gets washed over in the flood of emails and nobody takes ownership. That ownership piece and the communications around the task is fundamental to a successful review and really keeps things from being missed. So early on, identify who's responsible as the primary project manager, who's the responsible review manager, who's responsible for quality control, who's responsible for ensuring all the correct evidence is collected. Every step of the way, you know who's responsible for that phase, and then you'll have a much better success rate, and things will get handled correctly.
Right. Thank you. Let me just add, we're focusing on communication within the project. That could be the partner, the associates, review teams, whether it's outside contract attorneys or whether it's associates within the firm, staff attorneys. So that's communication is key to a successful project. To tie this back into get our CLE credits, the 0.25 that hopefully you all will utilize. Let's talk about, we have a duty for communications with our clients. ABA Model Rule 1.4A and 4.1A discuss communications with our clients. And this has been promulgated within our state bar rules as 1.03 and 4.01. So we need to make sure that we are properly communicating, keeping our clients reasonably informed. And this ties back into understanding what's going on, understanding the type of case you have, the type of data you have, the potential stages and processes that you may need to take. So this ties closely into the duty of technological competency, which we mentioned earlier. So as you're running eDiscovery project, these two duties are definitely very important. Danny, anything to add about duty?
Yeah, from the outside service provider perspective, I'm surprised I have to say this, but many times attorneys allow me to communicate with clients without them on the CC line, and I make an explicit point to everybody on my team that's ever speaking to or communicating with a client that the attorney must be CC'd on all communications. It's just best practice. The agency relationship between the service provider and the attorney needs to be protected at all times, and privilege on those communications needs to be protected at all times. So yes, communications is critical. Follow the rules, but always ensure that your service providers are including at least one of your attorneys on every communication.
Right. Very good points. Very good points. So we're out of time. I'll ask Eric and Dwayne. Eric, do you want to share any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think the last thing I'll say is that it's important to be heavily involved in the full process. At the end of the day, it's the law firm and the lawyers that have to certify the production, have to certify that they've met all of their requirements, have to certify that what they found as privileged is truly privileged. So it's very important that you follow the process, you follow the deadlines, you keep it moving with the right personnel and the right number of people involved, and that the decisions you're making around productions, AI, TAR, analytics, deduplication, they follow any and all ESI protocols that you've already agreed to. And it's also important not to agree to ESI protocols until you find out whether or not the client has the ability to meet any of those obligations before you start collections.
Great points. Dwayne?
Yeah, just real quick, I'll just, we talked about communication, that to me, that ties everything that we've talked about together. A lot of what both Danny and Eric mentioned. But it's critical that you stay in communication, because it helps the entire process to stay in the loop, know what's going on, but it brings everything else together. A poorly communicated project can, a lot of times will end up being a disaster in a lot of different areas, and there'll be problems. But staying on top of communications, because the one thing that a partner is going to want to know, if there is going to be an issue, that partner wants to know as soon as possible to make a decision about, do they need to go to the client? Do they make a decision? So anytime there's going to be issues or that you've got to resolve, communicating is critical, but it's also communicating to the partner that, hey, we're on schedule, or no, we're not, and this is the reason why. And they need to be fully aware of what's going on. So I'll just say that's a critical part of the whole process.
Nice. Makes sense. Well, we want to thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining the State Bar of Texas Computer and Technology Section, CLE. Appreciate your being involved. Thank you for the questions. We will be following up with the email, and I think several of you have asked for materials. So we'll definitely send you around some materials, and definitely make sure that you get your CLE credits. Again, 0.25 is for ethics. Thank you very much. Everybody, I hope everybody has a fantastic day. Take care.
Take care, all. Thank you.
Thanks.